Thank you for the opportunity to give a presentation on the experiences in Norway with the Second World War, and especially Northern Norway. I've been part of two research projects that has investigated the experiences of the Second World War and with a particular emphasis on Northern Norway and also northern Finland and northwest Russia. And a natural point of departure for this presentation would perhaps be to use as a lens the strong tradition in Norway to organize the war in two distinct periods, because most Norwegians are familiar with the concepts of war and occupation, where the war lasted from the German assault on April 9th to the 10th of June. It was followed by 5 long years of occupation. In many ways, I think this periodization is very helpful as a tool for reflections on Norwegian experiences during this war. Indeed, most of the fighting in Norway did take place during the spring of 1940, and life under German rule was the main context for civilian life during the occupation. But this holds to be true for most Norwegians, but not all. In northern Norway and in eastern Finnmark in particular, civilian life was indeed affected by bombing and fighting throughout 1942, 43 and 44. This had to do with Finnmark being part of the Eastern Front, essentially, with the town of Kirkenes as one of the main harbors for supplies to German troops in the northern theater of operations. Also, Norwegian sailors, as well as soldiers mainly based in Britain, did take part in military fighting elsewhere. And that accounts for other groups too. So, perhaps another approach can help understanding the war and provide new layers of insight to see things a bit differently. From another perspective, the Second World War can be seen in the Norwegian case as a series of interrelated conflicts or wars, which all affected Norway in particular ways. And the premise for these conflicts is that they all fall under the description total war, where states mobilized power and resources to the limit. So first, there was the question of imperial competition and control over territories between great powers. Seen in this context, it can be argued, as the British historian Richard Overy does, that the Second World War started with Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and was followed by other imperial ventures before Hitler finally launched his operation on the Soviet. No, it's fine. On the Soviet Union. While other mature empires, you might say, such as Great Britain and France, fought back. Second, and clearly linked to this first element, there was the question of race and the racial war, where ideas about human hierarchies often determined how different groups, be it soldiers, ethnic groups, prisoners, peasants, etc., were treated. And we all know, of course, how Nazi Germany behaved, but the truth is that the racial hierarchies affected the ways in which many other states also acted. Third, there was this geo-economic element, a struggle over strategic resources, infrastructure, sea lanes. And the war for the seas was crucial, not only because it extended the enormous production capacity of the United States to Great Britain and the Soviet Union, and enabled the Soviet Union to withstand Germany militarily, but control over sea lanes, infrastructure, and natural resources were also important motives in their own right, as we've heard before, in the grand strategies of states. And also there was this pressing question of security issues in Europe before the war broke out in Europe. You might say that during the latter half of the 1930s, the international relations between the European great powers were either characterized by states motivated by greed, such as Germany, or fear and security concerns, such as Britain and France. Soviet decision-making might, on the other hand, be seen as kind of a mix of both tendencies. And finally, there was a war over ideas, international order, both before and during the war, but not least over the future after victory or defeat. So soldiers, resistance, and ordinary people were fighting, coexisting with, or actively collaborating with enemies, occupants, or allies for sure, but they were simultaneously fighting for what was to come. And freedom, when it finally arrived in 1945, soon became a contested concept in a divided world. And at first, I would say, what hit most hard was the economic conflict and the battle for the seas that hit Norway hardest. And we've heard a little bit about that, the blockade policies, and the British wanted to contract most of the Norwegian tank fleet, while Germany, on the other hand, instantly made the Norwegian fleet a military goal. A lot of ships were sunk by the Kriegsmarine, so little space was left for neutral countries, indeed. And then a combination of economic and security policy motives led to the actual assault on Norway. On April 1st, Hitler spoke to the military staff who had prepared Operation Weserübung, and he stated there that the operation was necessary because of the need to control Swedish raw materials, and the fact that Great Britain was bent on denying Germany such access. At other times, however, Hitler put more emphasis on military strategy, and that is the main context that historians see the attack on Norway in. And here, among other things, Hitler then said that this operation would anticipate English action against Scandinavia and the Baltic, secure our supplies of iron ore from Sweden, and provide the Navy and the Luftwaffe with the expanded basis for operations against England. And this economic vision for Norway and the wider Nordic-Baltic region was to a high degree felt in the north throughout the whole war. The question of the iron ore was a key for seizing the port and town of Narvik. But later, Germany put a lot of efforts into expanding the fishing industry and modernizing it. In fact, the Second World War introduced a massive industrialization of Norwegian fisheries and fishing industry. And Norwegian fisheries were intended for a leading position as a protein supplier in the German gross realm. Economic developments were even reflected in German propaganda and in the images of Norwegians. Newspapers emphasized that the region should develop under German leadership into a valuable outpost in the German Grossraum. Northerners were often portrayed as somewhat simple and unpolished, but also as industrious, indeed priceless. They were necessary to unleash the true economic potential of the North. This thinking also had a profound impact on the economy of the Sami reindeer herders, as the occupying forces demanded deliveries of reindeer meat. Plenty of examples display the degree to which reindeer meat was sought after, and consequently how several herds were much reduced in size during the war. When the German forces were on retreat in 1944, the Sami reindeer herders were even ordered to evacuate with their flocks to the south as a retreating meat supplier. They tricked both the German and the Norwegian occupying regime on that occasion, however, and saved the reindeer. In accordance with the imperial interests of Nazi Germany, the long-term goal was to conquer Lebensraum in the east. After the attack on the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June in 1941, the fighting on the Eastern Front dwarfed the other theaters of operation in scope and brutality. The fighting here had enormous consequences also for Norway, which became a platform, one small platform, for the German operations against northwest Russia. And the war on the Eastern Front was the major European war, and it established a northern theater from Karelia to the Arctic Ocean. This major European war explains why more than 40% of the German soldiers in Norway were stationed in Northern Norway, a region with only 12% of the Norwegian population. It was the reason why about half of all German soldiers in the entire Nordic region were deployed on the Northern Cap, referred to in Norwegian as Nordkalotten. In fact, the eastern part of Finnmark was under the military command of the 20th Mountain Army on the Northern Front, and not General von Falkenhorst, who commanded Wehrmacht forces elsewhere in Norway. Before the attack, a group of communists and socialists and male Jews were arrested because they were regarded as dangerous enemies. So this was the first arrests of major arrest of enemies of the regime, the Jews in Norway. Even further north, through the northeast Atlantic and the Barents Sea, convoy traffic formed the only real link between the Western powers and the Soviet Union in Europe. And the Eastern Front was dependent on, to some degree, on the outcome of the balance of power on this war for the seas. And much activity was taking place in the north connected to this. A substantial part, and this is a picture that shows this, a substantial part of the military resistance in northern Norway was connected to the question of control over sea lanes and the transportation over to northwest Russia. Those who are referred to as Norwegian partisans had this as their main task. And it made perfect sense, because the Red Army was dependent on supplies from convoy traffic. With warfare came enormous resources to build infrastructure, to fortify the high north with airports, roads, railways, and so on. And much was and seen in a European context. Norway is a special case because much was imported to Norway throughout the war. And Norway received lots of supplies in order to build infrastructure. The occupiers also brought slave laborers with them, prisoners of war and forced laborers who tried to withstand hunger, disease, and cold, and sometimes unimaginable brutality. Their treatment cannot be explained without reference to the racial war and Nazi ideas about human hierarchies. Around 13,000 Soviet prisoners of war, for instance, died in Norway. But there were many categories of people who were brought to Norway by German authorities during the war, and not all of them were treated as badly as this group. But there were others who were treated really badly, and the Yugoslavs who were brought to Norway in 1942, they were simply intended to die in camps in Norway. In the north, liberation too came at a great cost. The forced evacuation of the population of Finnmark and North Troms in the winter of 1944-1945 and the enormous destruction that followed the German withdrawal added a new layer to already dramatic war experience. Some 50,000 people from Finnmark and Northern Troms were forcibly evacuated, while 25,000 managed to hide and in other ways escape evacuation. The Wehrmacht prioritized the military withdrawal over the evacuation of civilians. This military priority also impacted the transport of civilians to areas further south. So largely one could say that civilians were actually forced to evacuate themselves. This was one reason why most of the forced evacuees were received by local communities further to the south in Troms and Nordland, and that they stayed there until it was possible to return home. This forced evacuation has been sometimes portrayed as peaceful. It was not. It was not peaceful at all. It is true that the good weather this autumn of 1944 and the vigorous civilian evacuation apparatus prevented the death toll from rising further, and that relief efforts alleviated human suffering. But at the same time, this was still a combat zone. And this was expressed in events that were ruthless and brutal, and which left their marks on people who experienced such things as we see here. It is a large discussion as to whether the forced evacuation was provided by military necessity or not. And it is quite clear that it was the civilian occupation leader in Norway, Reichskommissar Josef Terboven, who was the main architect of the forced evacuation. And that this had to do with political decisions, political thinking that from his side, because because he thought that if he left civilians behind, then the British and especially the exiled Norwegian government could make contact, and this could have an impact on the occupation regime, because they would lose every aspect of obedience. I called the last volume of this book series that I took part in, The Struggle for Freedom, because people who lived throughout this 5 years experienced what freedom and the rule of law and the possibility and security, what that really means. And soon these fundamentals was put under pressure again, and even contested in a new rivalry between states. I think that the Hungarian writer Sándor Márai said something important also in the case of Norway, when he described how the Red Army drove away German troops in Eastern Europe. A great people turned their, and I quote, "A great people turned their chariot rods of history through their immeasurable sacrifices at Stalingrad. The young soldier carried with him a form of liberation to all whom fascism persecuted, a rescue from the Nazi terror. But he could not bring the freedom itself, for that he did not possess." So I think that these experiences, and remember this is 3 years since the war had ended, that these experiences were so strongly felt that this was there is a glitch of a period of 2 or 3 years, and then these questions rise again, and the struggle for freedom continues. So, thank you.